I created this character who's a Mountie. Don't know why I did that, but and I had these slips of paper that were, you know, whatever, 3 inches by 2, and I punched a hole through the top of it and put a string through there, and then these would be circulated around the room, you know, behind the teacher's back, so that kids would be snickering. So I think, without ever thinking I'm going to be a writer, I started being a writer. And something about the experience of pleasing people that way must have got into me at that point, when I was 11 or 12.
Wayne Tefs flies under the radar in so many ways, given his accomplishments and, of course, his prolific output over the years. He's written 10 books, novels, he's won a couple of major awards.
When he first went to university, Wayne went into engineering, actually. You know, there's this very practical side to him, and then suddenly, boom, he switches into literature. And I think in some ways he's trying to look at that world, that practical, nuts and bolts world, but from a literary point of view.
He's quite a paradox, my brother. He's quite fascinating and sometimes irritating.
His students loved him. He was, you know, generous, kind, and understanding. He worked beautifully with students. But he decided that even though that was one of the things that he really loved, he was committed to being an artist, to being a writer.
Human beings have an inclination, if not an instinct, to tell stories. And I'm no different than anyone else in that respect. When I am sitting in the hockey locker room, there are guys who are great storytellers. They want to tell stories. And they're in there telling stories, and the next guy is picking that up and telling his story.
He's very meticulous, very systematic, you know. So I think it was something he always saw himself doing, but he wasn't going to just jump into it, you know. He was going to prepare the way.
I had been editing other people's writing. And it struck me more than once, I can do at least as well as this. So I did. I sat down one summer, because I was a school teacher at the time. So I had the summer, and I thought, I'm going to start, possibly finish, a novel this summer.
You know, he'd have notebooks that he'd take everywhere, and he has really small handwriting. And he would write in them in pencil, and just, you know, we'd be traveling or something, and I'd look over and he'd be writing down, you know, conversations that in the plane seats behind us or something, you know, or the bus seats across.
It was wonderful to have the privilege of, well, exploring one's own imagination. And so I really enjoyed it. I found it to be very exhilarating. Of course, I needed to show it to somebody whose judgment I valued and find out whether I had done anything worthwhile, and it turned out that the person that I asked was gracious enough to say, "This is wonderful." So I was able to go on then. Now when I look back at that first draft, I realize it wasn't wonderful, but it was okay.
He's someone who cares very much about writing and the craft of writing, and I have to say, when our marriage broke up, one of the trickiest things was dividing up the books.
I have 3 or 4 ideas, 3 or 4 novels, you might say, in my head all the time. And sometimes I'm really intrigued by one of them, and I don't know quite how to write it. Beowulf, the novel that I wrote about Reinhold College, was in my mind for 20 years before I knew what to do. I thought when I first started that you would make a chart, you know, a list, a diagram, a plot. No, I don't. In fact, I don't want to know where I'm going, in one sense. It's no fun if I have to get from A to Z by also getting to M and M necessarily. I want to have the freedom to let the thing speak for itself. So never really know where I'm going, and I never know how what I'm writing is going to end. How do you finish a novel? I mean, you just sort of abandon it, it seems to me, artfully. But, I mean, the trick is doing it artfully. When I wrote Dickie, you'll notice that it's however many chapters, it might be 28, it might be 44, I can't remember any longer. They're all quite brief. I wrote each of those on a given day, and I wrote the first sentence of the next one on that day, and stopped there, and said to myself, let my unconscious work on this overnight. And then I would write the next one, and the first sentence of the next one. And that novel came out of me, so to speak, in however many days there are chapters. Wow. Now, I went back and tinkered and, you know, elaborated, but certainly that was the process, and I loved that process. Yeah, it was a great process.
Hank Peterson went into the bedroom of his house one Friday morning about 6:30, carrying a shotgun. And when he came out, the lives of everyone in Red Rock had changed forever. It was Hank who was affected most, and Becky, his wife, and their son Scott, and Tommy Piper, who was the man inside the bedroom when Hank walked in with the shotgun.
With the mystery novel Red Rock, I gave away who did the murder in the first sentence, and then tried to spend the rest of the novel undoing that, so that by the end of it, you weren't quite sure whether, in fact, this person had done it. I like to set myself a goal to achieve other than getting the story down, because after you're relatively accomplished at this, you can just do it over and over again. That's no fun. I didn't need to make money writing. So the only reasons I would have been writing was for my own personal needs and my own personal pleasures. It's an enormous privilege to be able to do what I do.
He started off writing, I guess, in the tradition of people like John Updike and John Cheever, writing what were kind of urban stories of people who taught in universities, who had investments, who were engaged in the kind of marital breakdowns and reconfigurations.
Midlife crisis stuff, in a way.
The tension between what is this beautiful surface suburban middle-class life that I live and that a lot of people live, and what you and I both know is going on just beneath that, all kinds of turmoil and desire and lust and anger. Three of them are a trilogy based in this neighborhood and at Willow Island, which is just near Gimli.
Casual betrayal in back seats of station wagons, culminating in infinite corruption on weekends at ski resorts and conferences. Lies told in haste, rebounding, magnifying, multiplying, transforming conjugal simplicity into soap opera confusion. Phones quickly placed back in receivers, plastic warm with passion and guilt. Long silences over breakfast toast and coffee, the ominous ticking of clocks like a Japanese torture chamber.
His protagonists are often talking about moral issues and their desire to come up to the mark morally, or their worry that they won't come up to the mark morally.
Then he moved back into looking at where he had grown up in Northwest Ontario.
There are a number of books about the mining town that I grew up in, which was a relatively rough town.
About people whose lives are sort of lived close to the bone and who are in difficult situations. It's not just kind of middle class angst.
They center around sort of violent episodes, murders and that sort of thing.
There were, for a small town, a number of murders prompted by sexual liaisons and infidelities and so on. And of course they were the rage around the town for, some time. And so I was puzzled and intrigued and horrified and curious about all of that.
I think that he writes about masculinity, and I think that that has very much come from his own background and what it is to be a man, what it was to be a man when we were growing up.
I've written 2 books that I call docufictions based on the actual lives of people, where I take, it's a novel, but I take actual experience and research on that experience and interleave it with my own take, sort of asking the question, who was this person?
His novel Beowulf, which won the McNally Robinson Award for the Best Manitoba Book of the Year, it tells the story of an actual person that he knew who does a kind of amazing survival when his plane lands and his back is broken, and where death is imminent, but who through his knowledge of the backcountry, his knowledge of his survival skills, manages to keep alive and to get out of that.
It seems to me that Wayne's writing is really quite autobiographical. At one of his book launchings, Dennis Cooley was introducing him and said, we're all afraid that we're going to end up in one of Wayne's books. We live in terror of it every time a book is launched.
My father and I shared a coat when I was a student and he was a grown man, and that coat passed into my hands when he died. And so the genesis of that story was simply something that actually happened, but the story is not that.
He turned on me, his brown eyes wide. "You scared the daylights out of me," he said, standing there in that black coat. When I stepped up to him, he put his free hand on my arm and added with a grin, "Like the devil his own self, come to fetch me, too." He laughed at that, an unexpected brief sound in the cemetery, perhaps the first time anyone had laughed there among the tombstones and soughing trees. "It's that coat," he added, "nothing personal."
And that's true of a number of the stories in the collection, Meteor Storm. They're a little closer to me biographically, I think, than a number of the other things that I've written. Although a good psychologist would say, of course, they're all close, to you and at a different level.
There's one story where he's talking about his Uncle Bill who, lived in Carmen and had a pencil mustache. And that's my Uncle Bill who lived in Carmen and had a pencil mustache. It's just like,
I am part of a group of 28 cousins, and 2 of those 28 cousins committed suicide. One when I was maybe 17 and one when I was maybe 23. Can't remember exact dates. And those, of course, had a huge impression on me. I don't think I've ever been suicidal myself, but it certainly provoked the question, what brings you to that point?
My brother Ralph first tried to kill himself in the same year the Russians put a satellite into space. 1957, was it? The year Father began downing a bottle of whiskey every night. The year Mother found out what was behind the dizzy spells making her vomit every morning, of which more later. The year I turned 15 and Ralph, about to graduate from Red Rock High, 17. What a year.
He's very disciplined. He can sit down and write for blocks of time, and he's very interested in the craft of writing. For him, writing is also about reading. You have to read voraciously, and you have to take in other ways that other people have solved, these problems.
As an editor, you appreciate more and more the subtleties of writing, and of course you read other writers all the time, and you start to see what makes some people great and other people not. You may not like them, and you may not like what they write, but when I read Truman Capote, for example, I thought to myself, there isn't a flaw in this writing. It is technically perfect. Later I discovered that when you and I were going home with our friends from school, when we were 12 years old and kibitzing and throwing a baseball around, Truman Capote was writing sentences in his head. I think a lot of people who write a single narrative line, and they write a good story. I don't think that's very interesting in the end. I think I'm interested in what makes a story, and asking my reader in as subtle a way as I can, but often somewhat pointedly, to consider the question of storytelling. And the way that I try to do it is to, as I said, interleave often 2 or 3 narratives, so that the question keeps being asked, whose story is this, and what does it mean to tell a story anyway? And so instead of having 100% narrative, so to speak, getting down a really crackling good story, I'm always trying to cut across that story with the question, what is it that makes story?
He's always been very concerned with craftsmanship, whatever he's doing. I think that was true when he was an academic, when he was a teacher. I think he was a really good teacher. And now that he's a writer, I think he really wants to do it very well.
Certainly I've seen a lot of manuscripts from other people where there has been a good story written, but technically speaking, from the point of view of craft, bad writing. There's a famous story about Hemingway spending a whole morning writing one sentence of a short story that he wrote. Whether it's true or not, it is apocryphally true in the sense that a good writer, a great writer, puts as much effort into getting every word in every sentence as highly polished as possible. So I think I grew to appreciate that more and more. And even though the novels I write are 80 to 120,000 words, and of course every one of them can't be perfect, finally, you want to work at that and make it as polished as you can.
For him, like the sort of romantic stereotypes of the artist don't really hold, and I think he distrusts them. And for him, it's something you work at, and persistence is what gets you there in the end. And he's very dedicated, he's very disciplined, and he's persistent.
Dorothy Parker said, taking up whatever somebody said about inspiration and perspiration, she said, writing is 10% inspiration and 90% keeping your ass on the chair. And I have that latter thing. It's a labor of love, but it is labor. And you have to put as much time into the craft as you have to do into the inspired moment of personal revelation. I love going through every sentence and trying to make every sentence better. I like the tinkering. Some people don't. I do. All poets are cranky. I've dealt with a lot of them, and a lot of them are really good writers. They're all cranky. By comparison, people who write fiction are puppies.
I think my brother's really complex. The main facets of his character, I think, are he's very driven, he's very successful. I think he's lonely in some important way.
I think all writers are troubled at one level or another. And I sometimes think that the more troubled you are, the better a writer you are. It's a simple correlation, and I could be wrong about it. I probably am. But it makes me think that because I'm basically a happy person and have a wonderful life, that I'll never quite be as good a writer as somebody who is sort of messed up. That they have a better shot at immortality than I do. Maybe that's simple-minded. But there seems to be a truth to it. When I read about other writers who have big reputations and so on and so forth, and I read their books and they're really good, I then discover that they were total jerks or horrible people. And I'm not a really nice person maybe, but I'm far nicer than that, so I'm probably never going to be that good a writer.
As the founding fathers of Turnstone Press, Tefs, Cooley, and Arneson have really left their legacy in this province in the literary community. That organization is one of two or three that has really been responsible for building a literary culture in this province.
He's been editing for years for Turnstone Press, and he has brought a lot of really good writers into prominence.
He's edited Miriam Tefs and Margaret Sweatman.
Melissa Steele, he's edited Lois Braun, he's edited Michael Van Rooyen, he edited John Gould's book that was nominated for the Giller a few years ago. I would guess that Wayne has edited 100 or 200 books, quietly behind the scenes, helped other writers find their voice. Quite an amazing contribution.
I've been publishing since 1983, and I suppose it's kind of like a child having children and having them grow up on you. Publishing books, and then, you, of course, are very engaged with them when you publish them. Several years pass, you think, oh, that's not so good. You go back and read them 10, 15 years later, and you think, wow, the person who wrote these was young, but really quite bright.
He does have cancer, and that has been an important part of his life. He wrote an immensely popular book about his struggles with the cancer and the way he's been able to deal with it.
Going down into yourself in the way of meditation, visualization, and prayer was not easy for me. Each requires that paradoxical combination of intense concentration and mental letting go that leads to epiphanies and insights. At first, focusing this way proved frustrating. Progress was slow. Like most things that are worth doing, spiritual exercises require a lot of practice and patience.
Being diagnosed with cancer was transformative in his life, and he started to live more purposefully, I think.
He's very serious about what he does, and staying alive seemed to him a fairly important thing to do, and he's had a greater discipline than almost anybody I know. He exercises, he goes and he rides bicycles.
He's a big hockey player, always has been, still is.
With the result that he's in immaculate physical condition outside of the cancer, which he has to struggle with.
He became much more centered on what was really, really important to him, and I think that was Kristen and Andy, and he became softer as a person.
He lives a balanced life, an amazingly balanced life. He travels quite a lot. He has a good circle of friends. He loves to celebrate occasions.
I remember calling him one evening, and he said, oh, I can't talk to you right now because we're dressed for dinner. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, Kristen and Andy and I, we now have formal dinners, and so we all dress up, everyone's wearing something really nice, and we have wine and we have candles and we have music, and I don't think he would have taken the time to do that before he thought the time was really limited.
I was at a conference in Moose Jaw, the Moose Jaw Writers Festival, and Wayne was there. When Wayne came out to talk about cancer, the place was filled. He got maybe 4 times as much as any other speaker. People came in and they wouldn't let him stop. After he stopped, they just stayed to talk to him. And he has a remarkable way of making other people feel really good. And so that was a kind of important moment. And I was, I'm always amazed at his generosity and his sheer intelligence.
Winnipeg's a really good place to be a writer because it's not a dogfight here. I think it's a dogfight in some places. To be accepted for publication, to be given accreditation by your peers. Here we have the Manitoba Writers Guild, which is a very, very powerful instrument for people. We have local publishers. We have people who care about writing and who are not trying to exclude people as much as they are trying to include them. Morty Walker runs possibly the best book section in the country. And he promotes, in his own way, he promotes writers, local writers, and he's generous with the space he gives them and the time that the paper gives him. Yeah, I think it is. It's a good community.
He doesn't get the kind of recognition that many writers in our community have got. I think that's largely out of choice on Wayne's part.
He plays his cards pretty close to his chest emotionally, and so I can see how other people would see him as very private.
He seems to take his satisfaction from the work itself. He rarely gives interviews. You almost never see him out and about in the literary community. I do believe in both times when he's won major awards at the Manitoba Writers Awards, he hasn't even shown up to collect his prizes.
It's a kind of amazing amalgam of a man who is very private and who keeps the deepest secrets of his heart out of public discourse, but available through his writing, and who is at the same time gregarious and open and generous.
People write me that I've never met. People come up to me at book signings that I don't know. And the response that you get from other people who say, you're doing something good, you're doing something interesting, you're doing something that pleased me or entertained me, it takes me back to that boy who wrote the little Mountie stories. You keep going back to people's love, I guess is what it basically amounts to. You want to be loved if you're going to be a writer. In the largest sense of the word, do you love what I've done? Is what you're asking people. And when they respond by saying, I love what you've done, then you do it again.